like to introduce today's speaker, S.J. Hannes, who is not only an eminent scholar and linguist, but also a very good friend. So I'm very pleased that he could join us today, as well as all of you. And there's so much I could say about his many accomplishments, but in the interest of time, I'll just note the highlights. But if you want excellent and enjoyable reading, you can read his very long CV at your leisure. So Dr. Hannes received his PhD on French morphophonology from the University of Delaware in 1991, and he ultimately hopped the pond to England, where he was at the University of Durham for almost 20 years, most recently as a reader in linguistics, and he's currently a visiting fellow at Newcastle University. He's been a true blue phonologist all the while, exploring phenomena in many languages, but most notably and relevantly for the series, Welsh. So he has written the book on Welsh phonology, and I'm not kidding, and many papers on the subject as well, on topics that also make my heart sing, like prosody and sonority sequencing and things like that. He's also on his 4th edition of his Phonetics and Phonology book with Mike Davenport, and my favorite, also edited a book on phonological acquisition with Martha Young-Schulten. So I really could go on and on. There's a lot that I could say, but I do want SJ to be able to speak today. So I'll stop here by saying that in case you didn't know, he also makes a mean loaf of bread. I can tell from all his Instagram pictures, and I'm very envious of that skill. So now I'll hand it over to SJ, and he's going to share his thoughts with us today on 3 puzzles in Welsh phonology. Thank you, SJ.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was a lovely introduction. Right, today, what I'm going to do today is rather different from what I normally do when I'm giving a paper. Normally, when I'm giving a paper, I've got some set of data that I'm presenting some knockdown analysis for, to try to convince you that my analysis is the right way to go with that particular set of data. What I'm going to do, though, different today, is talk about some data that are in search of a good analysis. What I want to do is present some data to you. You'll have, if you've seen the abstract, you'll know what it is I'm talking about. But what I find particularly interesting about these data is that in some cases they go against the expectations that one has as a phonologist, and in other cases they present some interesting in terms of phonological theory. So what I want to do is to consider these 3 sets of data. Actually, I talk about them as 3 sets of data, but they're actually interlinked with each other. And the more I think about this stuff, the more I recognize that they are actually connected to each other, even though they've always been described or written about as pretty much separate observations. I should also say that the data I'll be talking about it's robust. You find it all over with Welsh speakers, and it's been documented for a long time. So a lot of the data I have actually was first noted, to my knowledge. I mean, it may well have been before that, but to my knowledge, we're talking the beginning of the 20th century, so 1913, when there were a couple of particularly important books written on Welsh. So what I'm talking about are what I consider to be phonologically interesting sets of data that are in search of a solid analysis. Before I get into the data, let me just lay out some assumptions and some background. It's always nice to know where somebody's coming from in order to see why they're making the choices they're making or why they're doing what they're doing. So in amongst my assumptions are that whenever you're looking at some set of phonological data, you're looking at the data as they occur within a phonological system. So each of the phenomena I want to look at occurs within the phonological system of Welsh. So what? Well, what that means for me is that any analysis has to be compatible with a framework that accounts for Welsh phonology as a whole. So in my case, I mean, just to take my Phonology of Welsh, Hannah's 2013, that I wrote in the framework of optimality theory. So an account of these phenomena in the first instance should be compatible with OT or possibly stratal OT. But, and this is important, other frameworks may well yield interesting insights. I'm not saying that, you know, OT is the only way to go, not at all. But I'm not pursuing accounts in other frameworks here. If anybody's interested, there's a bunch of real interesting papers on Welsh phonology by Tomas Czerniak, who happens to work in a government phonology framework, so something very different from OT. It's certainly worth a look. Czerniak 2014, 2015A, and 2015B are in the references if you're interested. The other assumption I ought to make, or to make explicit, is that I understand phonology to be distinct from phonetics. Phonetics may provide evidence for phonological analyses, but personally, I'd be very happy with a substance-free phonology. I don't think that if we really understand phonology, that we're going to get there simply by restricting ourselves to phonetics. Now, in Welsh, across Wales, there's a great deal of phonetic variation. There's a lot of regional variation in lexis, but I would suggest that there's actually fairly little phonological variation among the different dialects. Okay, so those are essentially my background assumptions. What I want to do for the next few minutes is just look at some preliminaries. I'm not assuming that everybody is au fait with Welsh phonology, so I wanted to just give you a few of the facts, just to make sure we're all up to speed with that. Stress in Welsh, regular stress falls on the penultimate syllable. So in one, we can see that in each of those four words, Cymru, ysgol, prifysgol, ysgolion, the next to last syllable is stressed. I should also point out that in Welsh, schwa is not a reduced vowel. It's a full vowel in its own right, and it can be stressed. And in 3 of the 4 forms, in one, schwa is in fact in the stressed syllable. So don't let that bother you. Does Welsh have irregular stress? Yes, it does. And that often falls on the final syllable and is often associated with a specific suffix. So Cymraeg in 2 and parhau. And just for an interesting contrast, if you look at Cymraeg with final stress, that contrasts with Cymru in 1 with penultimate stress. And there are also words, loan words particularly, that bear irregular stress, like parade, raccoon, paragraph, policy. So I mean, these things occur, but overwhelmingly, Welsh words are stressed on the penultimate syllable. Another bit of information that will come up again: Welsh has a minimal word constraint. Content words must be at least bimeraic. So a monosyllabic word with no coda consonant will have a long vowel. And you can see this in 4. And here, and I'm also making an assumption here that vowels in Welsh underlyingly are all short. So if you have a long vowel, it's there for a reason. And the reason in 4 is to ensure that da and ki are bimeraic, so that they can occur as content words. 5 is just there for interest. I find it kind of interesting that the word meaning again has 2 different forms. Sometimes you hear it as eta, sometimes you hear it as ta. What I find interesting there is that when it's bisyllabic, it meets the minimal word condition, so it just stays as eta. And yet, if you drop off the first syllable, you've got to lengthen the vowel, so you get ta. I just think that's kind of an interesting illustration of what I'm talking about. Again, for background, the binary foot appears to play a pretty big role in Welsh. And Welsh shows a strong preference for binary trochaic feet. And that preference is directly related to a number of phonological processes in the language, including, and we've got them coming up in a moment, the resolution of sonority sequencing violations, the variable surfacing of underlying H, and the deletion of the antepenultimate syllable in specific word forms. So what am I talking about? Well, in 1.3.1, what that's illustrating is that there's good reason underlyingly to accept that this word meaning people ends underlyingly with a b followed by a l. L is more sonorous than b, so as phonologists, we wouldn't expect to find that in a coda. Well, what happens in Welsh is we don't. We find it underlyingly, but in fact, that coda is repaired by bunging in a copy of the first vowel. So what happens is we get a bisyllabic trochaic foot, which serves to get rid of that sonority sequencing violation. The word in 6b, underlyingly, again, there's good reason to believe that R is there underlyingly. Reasons such as, for instance, the plural, which has the r there before a regular plural suffix. What happens in this case is that, again, we have a sonority sequencing violation. Phonologists, well, phonology doesn't like a T followed by a R. What Welsh does is get rid of the R. We end up again with a bisyllabic word with a trochaic foot. So these are just illustrations that there is something interesting about the bisyllabic trochaic foot that is important within the phonology of Welsh. Rather than looking at 132 and 133 in any detail, you can refer back to that as you wish on your own handout. And I'd be very happy to talk about any of that stuff as we go along, if anybody wishes. Okay, so that's background. Let's look at the puzzles. First puzzle is what I call the coda conundrum. So there's a robust observation that has problematic implications for current phonological theory. And that observation is that in Northern Welsh, there are specific coda clusters that appear to be weightless. Now, this is one of the areas where Northern Welsh and Southern Welsh dialects do have a phonological difference. This is one of them. So puzzlingly, although the consonants involved in the clusters, so let me start that again. Puzzlingly, what we find is that the consonants involved in the clusters, we can skip ahead to 12 for just a moment. So here I'm going to be talking about F followed by T and S followed by T, just as examples of what I'm talking about. What's interesting, or what's puzzling, is that in 11b and in 11c, what we see is evidence that T and F, that's the voiceless lateral fricative, both of these, it must be the case that they project a mora. Why must it be the case? Well, because if they didn't project a mora, we would expect to find a long vowel here, just exactly like we find a long vowel here in order to meet the minimal word condition. Okay, so I'm assuming then, on the basis of that evidence, that T is moraic in coda position and that F is moraic in coda position. Okay, fine. So what? Well, the so what is that what we find is that with F and T in the coda, or with S and T in the coda, suddenly we're finding a long vowel here, contrary to any expectations. So what appears to be going on here, is that Northern varieties of Welsh have two systematic exceptions to mora projection. So a monosyllabic word with a coda cluster consisting of SC or FC has a long vowel. And this is contrary to any expectations we have when we're looking at the language and see that some singletons seem to be projecting a mora, including t, including f, including s. And yet when they combine together in a coda cluster, the vowel is lengthening, which again seems to indicate that these clusters are not projecting a mora. Okay, fine. You ought to be saying, well, you know, show me. Might it not be the case that all coda clusters in Welsh don't project a mora? Well, unfortunately for that hypothesis, no. What we have in 14 is simply an example of each of the occurring coda clusters. While you're looking over that, and I'll come back to a couple of things here in just a moment, let's just remind ourselves that under standard assumptions, a language with a bimeraic minimal word is expected to have a long vowel or a diphthong in a monosyllabic content word consisting of an open syllable. So if we look at Hayes, 1989 and 1995, weight by position. So through weight by position, a monosyllabic content word with a final consonant may or may not have a long vowel, depending on whether or not the consonant itself attracts a mora or projects a mora. And this varies across languages and within languages. So a monosyllabic content word with a final cluster would, in any case, be expected to have a short vowel, under the assumption that a coda cluster should attract a mora. Alternatively, such a word would have a long vowel if coda clusters in general in the language failed to attract a mora. How could we model that? Well, for instance, with Ito's 1986 coda condition would be just one way of approaching it. But when we look at the clusters in 14, the clusters in 14 are doing exactly what we expect, with 4 exceptions. The exception here of cosp, where we have a long vowel. The exception here of fasc, where we have a long vowel. The exception of gwaft, where we have a long vowel. And the exception of cluist, where again we have a long vowel. All of the other coda clusters are behaving exactly as we would expect them to behave, in that they appear to be projecting a mora, which is why we've got a short vowel in each of these cases, apart from the 4 that I've pointed out. So descriptively, and let me also point out the footnote. So the voiceless lateral combines only with t in a coda cluster. So in principle, we ought to be able to find fp and fk, but there appears to be this gap in the system. Now, either it's an accidental gap, or possibly somebody with more historical background could tell me why it doesn't occur, but it doesn't. Okay, so descriptively, the behavior of the exceptional coda clusters, it looks like straightforward extraprosodicity. By that I mean phonetic material apparently invisible to phonological operations. Hayes, 1995, for instance, has an interesting discussion of extrametricality. Now, let me say a word about terminology. Extrametricality typically refers to situations in which phonetic material doesn't count towards stress assignment. So, for instance, in a language in which closed syllable normally counts as heavy, and in which a heavy syllable typically attracts stress, yet where you have in final position a closed syllable that doesn't attract stress, we talk about extrametricality. The weight of that syllable appears to be invisible to the operation assigning stress. And from that, one can infer that the final consonant is extrametrical. And there's a bunch of stuff in the literature on extrametricality that I won't go into here. So what it looks like descriptively, I'm not talking about theory at the moment, but just descriptively, it appears that S consonant clusters and F consonant coda clusters in monosyllabic words in Northern Welsh are extraprosodic. They don't project a mora, so they don't count towards word minimality. And consequently, the vowel in a monosyllabic word ending with one of these coda clusters lengthens to satisfy word minimality. Okay, fine. So the observations are absolutely robust. You find them in prescriptive grammars, you find them all over the place. The observation is robust that as a singleton, F in a coda appears to be moraic, and yet when it combines in a coda cluster, and when S combines in a coda cluster with other consonants, they are non-moraic if we're measuring moraicity in terms of vowel length in monosyllabic words. Okay, so what? Well, the so what is when we come to look at this in terms of optimality theory, we find richness of the base militates against simply marking as extraprosodic anything in the lexicon. So even if descriptively we're happy with thinking about these things as extraprosodic, phonetic material cannot be marked as invisible to phonological operation. So OT has no mechanism for translating diacritic marking of lexical material into phonological invisibility, unlike pre-OT approaches. So pre-OT, you could simply diacritically mark phonological material as being invisible. The phonological rule would subsequently fail to apply to that material. Okay, so it's an interesting problem here. And as it says in the handout, there's another restricting factor as well. And that restricting factor is that when we look at codas in general, there are two sets of coda consonants which exhibit predictable behavior. There are those consonants that in a coda position attract a mora, and they are p, t, k, m, n, and f. And there are those that fail to attract a mora, b, t, g, f, th, ch, v, th, and s. I should also mention there's another smaller set of consonants, including n and l, that swing both ways. They sometimes attract a mora and sometimes don't, and I think this has to be lexically specific. So the problem for optimality theory, though, is that given these two sets of differing behaviors, that behavior has to be modeled as falling out from constraint interaction and not underlying specification. So the conundrum of these consonant clusters in Northern Welsh co-occurring with long vowels can be understood, as I've already said, as a failure to project a mora. But the question for phonology is how to model that failure of these clusters to project a mora, while at the same time accounting for mora projection by other clusters and by specific singletons in the absence of diacritic marking. So I mean, I think it's a real interesting puzzle. Maybe it means, well, it could mean a bunch of things. It could mean that OT is the wrong framework to be working in. It could mean that there's something else going on. It could mean any number of things, but so far so good. Let's move on to another puzzle. This puzzle has to do with syllabification. In fact, this puzzle and the next puzzle both have to do with syllabification. And since syllabification also has to do with onsets and codas, in fact, I'm getting a stronger feeling than ever that the things I'm calling puzzles here are in fact interconnected in some way that I haven't quite figured out yet. But let's look at it. So the puzzle 2, typologically, languages prefer to syllabify consonants as onsets rather than codas. And all of the phonologists in the audience are well aware of this. This is one of the tools in our toolkit that we look for and that we teach our undergraduates. This is also reflected in optimality theory. For instance, the existence of an onset constraint, so the constraint onset, has no complementary coda constraint. And one of the reasons to think this is probably fairly accurate on some level is that onsets may be obligatory in a language, but codas aren't. So there's probably something good here. So the typical expectation is what we see in 15, that the C in the string in 15 will syllabify as an onset rather than as a coda. And we know that some languages, French and Spanish, for instance, just do this rampantly. Any C followed by a V becomes an onset. We even find that in languages like English, this phonological tendency may also be overridden by morphology. So for instance, in 16 A and B, we see a difference in syllabification across class 1 suffixes, so ity, as compared with class 2 suffixes, ism. What contrast do I see here? Well, the L in optimality, if you have a clear dark distinction in your variety of English, that L is going to be clear, which is indicative of being an onset. The L in optimalism, if you have the clear dark distinction in L, is going to be a dark L, indicating coda position. Welsh, well, Welsh is perfectly well behaved word internally. Words like araf, gyda, tatus. So a single, as Morris Jones expressed it in 1913, a single consonant between two vowels belongs normally to the second syllable, and he gives the examples of cani and gweledig. But there are some interesting apparent counterexamples to the expected phrasal resyllabification. So cases where potential onsets are left unfilled, even adjacent to codas, which could fill those onset positions. In other words, here again, we've got something that is behaving contrary to our expectations as phonologists, in that we have a potential onset that is syllabified as a coda. So look at the behavior of the definite article in 18. So the definite article is ar. Ar has 3 different flavors. It sometimes occurs as ar before a vowel. For instance, ar avon. It surfaces as a before a consonant. So we have amor in the C. And this article also appears as r when it follows a vowel. So for instance, here in this example in 18, we have the preposition o, meaning from. We have the noun avon, river, and our definite article ar appears as r, which is encliticized to the o. Now, what's interesting for our purposes at the minute is that what we don't find is o ravon. In other words, the R syllabifies as a coda, even though there's an onset position just hanging out, waiting to be filled, but it won't be. It won't be because for whatever reason, Welsh prefers this particular R as a coda, not as an onset. And especially when you consider that this R, I mean, we've got some cliticization going on here. So these aren't even content words, you know, your preposition and your definite article, and yet they are exhibiting a behavior that I find somewhat puzzling. Now, if you're interested in the behavior of the definite article, there's a paper that Maggie Talman and I published in 2006 that's in the references. It's an account of the distribution of the article, but not about its syllabification. So more work to be done here. So following a vowel final word, the ra of the article syllabifies as a coda rather than as an onset, despite the availability of an onset position. And again, what makes this particularly interesting, I think, is that, okay, what about the syntax? Well, syntactically, the definite article is more closely affiliated with the following noun than with the preposition. So, yet, for whatever reason, what we find is this ra in coda position rather than onset position. Another example that there's something weird going on here. It's different behavior from what we've just seen with the definite article, but again, there's something interesting and unexpected going on here. Okay, there is a real interesting paper on Welsh and Welsh phonology from 1957, actually 1957-58, by Herbert Pilch, and he's looking at syllabification among other things, and he's looking at this phrase llanw a thrau, which means flow and ebb. It could be glossed indeed as flow and ebb. Now, what he finds interesting and unexpected about this, and so do I, is that the syllabification he finds takes that th. So th, what's written th in Welsh is also, it's a voiceless interdental fricative, just like English th. And what's going on here is that th is being syllabified as a coda rather than as a complex onset, despite the fact that thra is a perfectly permissible onset in Welsh. Now, what I find even more interesting, and I don't recall that Pilch said anything about this aspect of it. Okay, this word thrai. Well, underlyingly, it's trai, and that t has undergone aspirate mutation. So in fact, thrai is the aspirate mutation form of trai. So in a real sense, the syllabification in 19 not only fills a coda, it's separating two bits of an otherwise permissible onset. So I mean, there's something going on here. Going back to one of the other big names in Welsh phonology, whoops, again from 1913. If you look at what Morris Jones says about syllable division in Welsh, and this may have some bearing on what we're looking at. When there are two or more consonants, the first belongs to the first syllable, as cantor, singer, canyad, song, tanwydd, firewood, cantref, 100, district. Unfortunately, he doesn't address the question of syllable division involving permissible onsets. But clearly he is saying that there is at least this tendency to split between two consonants. Okay, as with the coda conundrum that we saw earlier, it's not entirely clear how to model the facts of this syllabification with the tools available, though it's likely that a meaningful analysis will have to consider not just phonology, but also morphology and possibly lexical specificity as well. And what I find interesting here in connection with what we were looking at earlier is that, again, we've got this preference for a coda. So there's something going on here with the coda. Now, this whole question of phrasal syllabification, I think, becomes even more interesting with one more connected phenomenon. So the last of our puzzles for this morning or this evening, if you're in England. And it's what I'm calling feature fission. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about here is a case where you've got a single segment and there are two features associated with that segment, but under certain conditions, those features are split and assigned to two separate segments, so two different segments. And what we've got here is a connection between feature assignment on the one hand and again, phrasal syllabification. What we're looking at in 19 is a set of consonants that have been variously described as voiceless sonorants or aspirated sonorants, or sometimes voiceless aspirated sonorants. So orthographically, for those who are interested in how these things are written in Welsh, these are RH, MH, NH, and NGH, respectively. Why are there three different descriptions of these? Well, in part, there is variation across dialects, and we can probably find each of these versions in some dialect. So it's not that nobody can agree what these things are. It is rather that these things occur in their different guises in different dialects. So we don't need to worry about that. Now there's good evidence that these guys are single segments, and in word initial position, they typically show up as voiceless sonorants. So shy, for instance, Hnad, meaning my father, and even word medially, we can find them, all shrine, trace. Let me also mention that shrine here and shy are underlyingly voiceless sh. That voiceless nasal is the result of nasal mutation. So one could argue that its status is somewhat different, but one could also argue that, well, it's occurring. It occurs at the surface. It occurs word initially in that position. So regardless of its origin as a nasal mutation expression, doesn't really alter the picture. Now, if we look at these things phrasally, so I've been looking at phrasal syllabification, well, what we find is that sometimes in a phrase, we find it syllabified exactly as we would expect. So my rhai, some are, so is plus some, my rhai, perfectly well behaved, perfectly what we expect. The hnad, my father, hnad. Again, there's nothing remarkable about this. It does what one would expect, what a phonologist would expect, given this data from Welsh. Okay, where it becomes interesting and where it becomes puzzling is that sometimes you find these phrases syllabified differently, as in 22. What we've got in 22 is exactly the same phrases, but what's happened is that here we have a voiced r. It's no longer a voiceless one. This essentially has been split. It's been split into a voiced r occurring as a coda, followed by ha. So the voicelessness of this is being expressed in an onset position here, yet the sonorance is being expressed in a voiced segment in coda position. We find exactly the same thing with vnad, had. Again, we've taken this voiceless sonorant, turned it into a voiced sonorant in coda position, followed by glottal fricative, voiceless glottal fricative in onset position. So again, something really cool is going on here. So with a coda position available, segment fission occurs, or can occur, and the voiceless sonorant splits into two segments, a voiced sonorant followed by H. And this distribution, so what we're seeing here is that the distribution maintains the features of sonority and voicing of the input segment, so sh and na, yet it allows both output segments to appear in less marked positions. That is, a word initial voiceless sonorant is preserved where necessary. So when we see it alone, shy, I mean, that is not going to become r, high in anybody's Welsh. So it's preserved where necessary, but it can be split into a voiced sonorant plus H. What that does is preserve the features associated with that segment, despite the fission of the segment itself. So, as with the coda conundrum and the syllabification of the article, the observations surrounding this behavior are robust. I mean, they're commonplace. They're not marginal exceptions at all. And since they occur so frequently, they should be straightforwardly analyzable in one's preferred theoretical framework. There are a couple of more questions. Yeah, let me look at these questions. And there's one other thing I want to share with you in just a minute. So if we're looking at these three things, the coda conundrum, the phrasal resyllabification, and the feature fission, it seems to me that there are a number of questions that have to be investigated along with this, in addition to figuring out what to do with phonological theory in order to be able to deal with this stuff. So the questions include the question of how widespread the resyllabification is in Welsh that results in filling otherwise empty coda positions. And we can see from Pill's example, the Llano a Thrai, that it's not restricted to voiceless nasals. There's other stuff going on here, and I'm sure that's true. In the second question I ask here, what other segments undergo fission under syllabification? Is it just the voiceless nasals, or is there something else going on? In fact, let me stop for a moment. There's one other thing. I know I'm running out of time. But there's one other thing I want to share with you. If I can find it here. Yeah. Something really interesting going on here that it just struck me this afternoon that, hang on, wait a minute, there is something very, very similar in terms of features or feature spreading or whatever you want to call it. So nasal mutation, I don't have time to go into. As good culticists, you all know what nasal mutation refers to anyway. In Welsh, one of the triggers for nasal mutation is the first person singular possessive. It has various incarnations in Welsh. One of them is un. So here we're taking the underlying form un, my, kegin, kitchen. So each of these words on its own is as shown here. What's interesting is that this final N in the possessive acquires the place of a following consonant, so that N underlyingly becomes angma, ang, ung. But what's really cool is that the initial segment of the second word, kegin, so a voiceless velar plosive, voiceless velar stop, shows up as a voiceless nasal, voiceless velar nasal. So it keeps the place of articulation, velar, it keeps the voicing, voiceless, and yet it acquires the nasality. Whereas the final segment of N keeps its nasality but acquires the voicing. So you've got this kind of cross-pollination. That again, it strikes me that whatever our puzzles are, that's looking like another interesting puzzle. And again, if you looked at this simply in terms of autosegmental phonology and feature spreading, no big deal. But how can we do this in a different framework? It's another question. One could ask what role complex onsets might be playing. The fifth question I've got here is simply a question about whether phonological structure, such as syllable count, may be playing some role. So for instance, we've had my chis showing up as my his, Reese is, so that's not uncommon at all. What I would like to look at, and I haven't looked into yet, is would this happen if the following noun was multisyllabic? I don't know. I've got to ask some Welsh speakers. I haven't got there yet. Finally, what if any of this is tied to the behavior of H on its own? And Mike had a manuscript in 2010 that asks some interesting things about the behavior of H. And that, dear friends, I think is all I've got to say for now. Thank you.
Yay! Thank you so much, SJ. That was a really interesting talk. You're right, lots of puzzles to think about. We do have a slew of questions for you, so I'm going to start with one of Mike's, although well, I think this one is easy. Okay. Mike asks about the restrictions. This is with respect to puzzle 1. He asks about the restrictions on consonant sequences in codas. You want to parse that? He's sitting right here.
I think you actually answered it later, but the st, the guasht, so st doesn't occur before any other consonants.
That's right. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I guess maybe I'll ask the question differently. Is there any way, this is me being desperate, any way to argue that the LLT is actually a possible onset? And the reason is because Cleast is, that's an ST, that's a possible
absolutely
onset.
Absolutely. No, I had a really interesting discussion probably 6 or 7 years ago with Karen Rice, who had seen what I was working on and said, SJ, have you thought about modeling these as onsets? It's a brilliant idea, but it just doesn't work. Just doesn't work for various reasons. But,
fair enough.
But hey, I mean, you and Karen Rice thinking along the same lines, that's got to count for something.
Hey, I'm happy for the company. That's a good company.
Exactly.
Alrighty then, and the next question comes from, and Kevin, I apologize if I get your last name wrong, but Kevin Rotet. Do you want to just go ahead and ask your question or your comment about Good Lord?
Sure. I think there's a question after mine that is about the same thing. But so I was just wondering what might be going on in cases like, so you encounter the form rarglois from rarglois, as an interjection. And then I think there's a city in a town in North Wales called Rhyl, which is often just called Rhyl. And I understand that etymologically this is plus the English word hill. So there are a few examples of this. I wondered what you thought of those.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things going on here. I would like to think that they're connected with some of the stuff, but I'm not sure there are. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Newtown, Drenewydd, technically there should be an there to make the tre mutate to Drenewydd, and yet that's usually omitted, and yet you still get the mutation there. So I suspect there's something going on with place names.
Okay, a form like rargloid is an interjection. So, and then the next question had to do with someone can elaborate on that. I don't remember who wrote it, but the paradigm radui roiti radini, where it's the etymologically the definite article plus a form of the verb to be, where are has apparently become the onset of the.
Yeah, no, those are good examples. Those are good examples.
Yes, and that was Johann Heinecke mentioned about those, however you say those.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's something to think about.
Okay. Next one is another Mike Hammond question. So
What is
he's
it? What is the question? It's really small.
ST in a cluster can begin a word. Oh, you asked that one.
I asked that one.
What about that one?
Oh, actually, he answered that. So, well, I'll change the question. So I have a question here, but I'm going to change it. So you talked about these cases where singleton consonants get these interesting splits. And so I had written an example here where shaf turns into half, something like that.
Yeah.
What the one I'm wondering about, so I'm reading a novel right now, a tawdry novel by Bethan Guanas, if you know her, who writes a number of tawdry novels, so they're great. But she, in her orthographic practice, she doesn't write va all the time. And what she writes is very interesting. So when you have a possessed noun, it depends on what the previous word is. So if the previous word ends in a vowel, she doesn't write the va. So something like, if we wanted to say something like from my father, she would probably just write I don't know how she would syllabify, but she writes nhad. And the va in dialogue isn't written at all.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, if the preceding word ends in a consonant, the va is written. And again, I don't know how she intends for it to be pronounced, but those are the only two options. Either va is not written if the previous word ends in a vowel, or is written.
It's consistent, though.
Go ahead. It's consistent, right? And, if it actually does reflect how, people are talking in her dialect area, it's presumably the absence of va with a preceding vowel would be consistent with your story. That is, in those cases, something like o and had, that must mean that she intends for it to be pronounced on had. That preceding vowel is providing a home. But when the preceding word ends in a consonant, then she writes the va, because then the potentially complex onset. And I'm just wondering if that practice might be another instance of this splitting that you're observing, and that it's, if you will, orthographic support, or potentially orthographic support for the syllabification you're talking about.
Cool. No, I'm not familiar with that author of tawdry novels. If you could just send me your name sometime, that'd be good.
I will. Very tawdry.
Okay. And Kevin, again, I just wanted to double check that you mentioned you have another example about my sister.
Right. I mean, so this is actually related to the question we just had. So it has to do with, the first person singular possessive word. So, in spoken Welsh, you encounter cases like, where for my sister, instead of vachwair, a lot of people say what sounds like nhwair. So you're actually effectively getting an N sound, even though there is no nasal mutation, because chwa can't undergo nasal mutation. So I just thought I would bring that up.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. And then David Willis actually has a comment about the historical question that you asked. And so, David, do you want to contribute rather than have me read it?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So yeah, partly it was an answer to a question you raised towards the beginning, which is why you could only get est and you couldn't get sk and sk. I can give you the historical reason for that, which is to do with early Welsh sound changes, but I think they just raise another question, which maybe I could back you. So the historical reason is that if you get there's a series of sound changes where you get an L or an R plus a voiceless stop. And in all cases, what happens is that the voiceless stop becomes a fricative, except in the sequence LT, when you'd expect LT to become ulth, like all the other ones, but it becomes st, which gives you your problem. So maybe I can flip it back to you and say, is there any reason why all of those 5 combos should go one way and then LT should become st and not ulth, which on the face of it, ulth seems like a perfectly good sequence of sounds for a language to innovate.
Yeah, it does. No, I'm off the top of my head, no idea.
I mean, is it something to do with the place of articulation? I mean, there's sort of it's the 2 with the closest articulations, isn't it? I mean, they're both dentalish.
Yeah.
Mike?
So I was just going to offer, I mean, it's that you don't get L th, right?
Yeah.
So there is the pattern of friction affrication in Spanish, right? So like the D's that turn into thes, it doesn't happen after L. The D's that turn into thes intervocalically in Spanish. So the L, it's like a homogeneity thing. So you don't want to get that fricative after an L because the L and the D are in the same place. And I bet you this restriction in Welsh is related to that. It's the homogeneity of the L and the stop prevent the stop from becoming the fricative, as in modern Spanish.
That sounds good.
Well, I just made it up, so hopefully it's good.
Okay. Well, that was the last question that we had. And it actually is exactly 11 a.m. in Arizona time. So perfect timing all around. And so let's just thank our speaker one last time. Thank you so much, SJ. And also thanks to all of you for coming to hear his words of wisdom. And we will catch you at the next talk. So please come to our next in the series. Bye, everybody.